Hello and welcome to another episode of Spiritually Incorrect. On this episode we have Muslim apologetics, the best evidence for design, and Jonathan now doubting that the world actually exists. I'm your host Seth Hart. Join with me is Jonathan Lionheart.
Or am I? Is anything real at all? I don't know.
Oh gosh. We're recording this after our post discussion where we get into a debate. Even though this entire episode is about the design argument, we get into a debate about how we know the world actually exists. Fun stuff.
They're related, though, because only a lot of design theorists will say that only if we are intelligently designed for rational thought can we trust our rational intuitions about the world.
That's a different argument, though.
No, but it's related. It's this sort of
Everything's related.
Argument that because we're designed and not just evolutionarily randomly pooped out, therefore we can trust our rational faculties because they were designed by a good and intelligent God. Therefore, you can know the world is real and that your intuitions about it are valid. They're connected. They're not totally disconnected.
That's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. The EAAN, John. That's not called
the design. They're the same. I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm saying they're related. They're related.
Everything's related. Hey, John, you know what's related to the design argument? The cosmological argument. Because the universe has to exist to be designed.
They're more specifically related in that design is required for the teleology leads to the epistemology in the argument. It's a relevant connection.
We're supposed to be the ones who aren't wordy. We're supposed to be the ones translating.
This doesn't make sense to anyone because they haven't heard the post discussion yet. So we just need to get back to the actual. Okay, who do we have coming on the show?
Merry Christmas, John. We have Santa Claus, and he's going to give us the gift the gift of being able to better communicate on our podcast, which is all about communicating better to people.
People love it when we argue with big words. Okay, well, so we're doing an episode on design today, and we have two guests. We have Dr. Shaoib Malik, who is a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. He has two PhDs, one PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Nottingham, and another PhD in theology from the University of St. Mary's, Twickenham, which means that he is very intimidating. And
he's been on the show before, though. He did our Muslim apologetic episode, so he's a returning guest.
Yeah, so I've been intimidated of him repeatedly for an extended period of time.
Have we had a repeat guest before?
I don't know. I guess he's our first repeat. Yeah.
There we go.
Well, he's just that good. He's just that good. He stands at the crossroads of science and religion. Particularly, he's exploring this sort of rising field of Islam and science and what it means to have an Islamic view of science, and vice versa. So he's really he's doing a lot of seminal, very exciting stuff. And he's joined today with Dr. E.V.R Kohonen.
This is also the first time we've had two guests that we're interviewing.
A lot of firsts here. Four people talking in one podcast. I mean, you and I are constantly talking over each other. But today we have four people who are going to talk over each other in a chaotic, not very well-designed conversation. But yeah, so we have Shaoib, and then we also have Dr. E.V.R Kohonen, who is a lecturer in systematic theology at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And Shaoib and E.V.R have recently written a book together, a book that they foolishly invited Seth Hart to contribute a chapter to. Seth, why don't you tell us about the book a little bit?
The book. Also, by the way, if you hear us refer to him as Erke or E.V.R, both refer to E.V.R. He's sometimes called Erke. He's got multiple first names. And the book is called Design Discourse in Abrahamic Tradition, History, Metaphysics, and Science. And the book is basically, it's the word Abrahamic discourse. It's about Jewish, Muslim, and Christian philosophers throughout history, contemporary, and the past. It's talking about how they have all argued for design, or teleological arguments, if you hear that term. Teleological arguments include arguments from design about features of the world appearing designed and therefore providing evidence for the existence of God. They're very popular arguments. Some of them are in biology about, irreducible complexity, creationism, and intelligent design really like these arguments. But some of them are not about that. Some of them are about our intuition. Sometimes we just get a sense that even if things evolved, maybe things are designed anyway, or they're about the cosmos. The universe might have features that are larger than just life forms that show evidence of design. So there's a lot of versions of these arguments, and the book itself kind of gives an overview historically about what people have argued for this in the past, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, and contemporary versions of it. And one of my chapters is actually a contemporary updating of an older argument.
Okay. So, are we designed? Is the world designed? Is there a designer? Let's get into it.
Thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be here.
So you guys have a new book out on the design argument. When did it launch?
Well, I mean, we haven't actually seen the physical copy of the book yet, but it's supposed to have come out on November 11. But we're basically taking it on fate that it is actually out.
That it's out there somewhere in the world. And it's on the design argument. What personally drew both of you to study the design argument?
Well, for me personally, I've just been interested in this whole issue of science and religion for a long time, and I felt this was one of the central issues. I mean, I looked at what people were debating, and it usually was the issue of whether nature is purposefully designed or whether there's some chance processes. Is there something that cares about us that's behind this? And I wanted to find out what have been the historically best arguments about this issue.
My starting point was actually Erke's first book. It's the one that he published with Routledge. When I was looking into evolution from an Islamic standpoint and writing up my monograph, I got into intelligent design and got sucked into debates. And I thought Erke's work was pretty much the best in the market. And we also, I think, met through St. Andrew's grant, the NVITA project, New Visions in Theological Anthropology, which is a grant awarded to them by JTF, John Templeton Foundation. And I think through certain sub-grants, both of us got sub-grants, we had a conference. Is that right, Erke? Is my memory correct that we used some of that money for that conference? Is that correct?
Yeah. So we had a conference on the metaphysics and history of design discourse. It was an online conference, but we had like an open call, and we asked for certain prestigious and well-known individuals to present on the design argument and its history. And that's where the book got its genesis, basically.
Yeah. Just to add to that, Erke was the one who thought of really pushing the borders of design discourse. So the central theme of the text is not just design, but Abrahamic design, right? Like, how do we understand discussions of design in the various Abrahamic traditions? So when you eventually get the book in your hands, either or on the screen or in your hands, you'll find that we have scholars from all three traditions, and there's a very good mix in there, both historical, contemporary stuff, people doing constructive work, people doing descriptive work, and that's what made this project very, very interesting.
And when you say Abrahamic faith, just in case anyone's unfamiliar, what are those three faiths?
Well, so that's Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But of course, the whole terminology of Abrahamic is kind of contentious in itself, because some people think that it doesn't really fairly represent everything you can say about these religions. But I mean, what term could do that? We decided to focus on these three religions because there's historically been quite a lot of interaction, particularly on natural theology. Like first the Christians and the Jews interact with Greek philosophy, and they learn all these arguments for God's existence. They develop them further. And then the Muslims learn these arguments from the Christians and the Jews, and then there becomes this whole interreligious conversation that's actually going on already in the Middle Ages, and that gets quite often forgotten in today's discussions. So when I first got into this whole discussion of design arguments, it was through the intelligent design movement particularly. So that's very contemporary stuff, like the people are trying to argue that science proves design in some way, an intelligent designer, not necessarily God even. And then others want to argue that science actually reveals us a universe that has no design behind it. But then when you start digging a little bit, you come up with all of these theological concepts that are actually lurking in the background. So we wanted to situate the design discussion in this broader context.
You said that there's Abrahamic perspectives from Christians, Jews, Muslims. Do you think that in any sense the greater story gives us some pause for thinking that this argument might still have new life?
Yeah, so I think that where we wanted to make sure we had a solid contribution was the history. So if you think about design discourses, largely you're looking at a few scholars, Philo or Hume and stuff like that, Paley. But as you'll read through the edited volume, once you get a copy of it in your hands, you'll find out that there's a lot of things that are mentioned by Jewish scholars or Muslim scholars, right? That I don't think is available in the English language as of yet. And even the way they argued for design was sometimes very interesting. So we have one chapter in there that talks about design through a kind of an Islamic version of the sensus divinatis, what is known as a fitrah, right? So there is this ready-made template within you that is very receptive to design. So there is an epistemic, what's it called, availability, potential for you to be awed by the world from the get-go. So this doesn't mean that you need mathematical quantification of the world or solid, propositional arguments. Just the very fact that you can stand and be in awe is some kind of priming for getting you to believe in God's existence. So those kinds of ideas that were unknown before are being brought to the English language for the first time. That's one area from the history side. And then from the contemporary side, we've had now some interesting developments, even where there's modern scholarship with contemporary dialogues, intelligent design being one of them. My own chapter, for instance, which I co-authored with 2 students, it's to do with an engagement with Stephen Myers, right? So his Return of the God hypothesis, he's one of the biggest faces of the intelligent design movement. We engage him on that from an Islamic lens to see that how we feel that this may not be the best way going forward as a strong design argument. So even within design, there are many arguments that you can go for, and we feel that the intelligent design stuff has some problems in there that make it susceptible to some versions of God of the Gaps kind of narrative.
So basically what you're saying is there still is this scientific argument, this counter-Darwin design argument. But there's also these other perspectives that you're trying to bring in that don't necessarily challenge the theory of evolution in any sort of way.
Yeah.
And yet we can still, in some sense, revive them.
Yeah, I think this is where Erke's work becomes very, very important. So his second book, Palgrave, what was the name of the text? Creation, what was the exact name?
The compatibility of evolution and
design. That is a solid text. I think I have it here somewhere. I can't find it, but that is
the compatibility of evolution and design.
Yeah. So I told Erke privately that you are Asa Gray 2.0. I told him that when it came out. And that's because Asa Gray had a very measured response, right? I feel like when Darwin was, feeling threatened, where evolution kind of undermined beliefs in God's existence, or at least, this idea that the world is very, finely tuned or has these amazing features that we can use to justify belief in God. For him, that undermined that case, right? Whereas Asa Gray said, all we've done is we've moved from specific entities for which we didn't have a process for. Now we have a process, and we could use that process to infer God's existence. And I think Erke does an excellent job in that particular text in updating that argument in light of developments like ID, developments in philosophy, that I think can, help us attain a higher resolution dialogue. And that informs some of the other chapters in the work as well.
So in this book, basically what we do is we look through certain examples, a lot of different examples of how design arguments have worked historically, and usually in these chapters the authors also relate what they say to this contemporary discussion. So for example, my own chapter is on early Christian design discourse. So I go through both well-known figures in early Christian thought, like Tertullian, Athanasius, and others who used a design-like argument. Like they talked about the issue of order versus chance. They talked about the analogies of the creator. For example, if you see a statue, then wouldn't you think that the statue must have an intelligent cause? Well, how much more must the human form, which informs the statue, might also have a kind of cause? So they use these kind of analogies. But what's interesting is that they also used analogies that have very little to do with this kind of machine metaphors that became so prevalent in the later discourse, particularly with William Paley and Hume and others. So, for example, Athanasius has a huge amount of these analogies, like comparing the universe to a big city that is ruled by laws. So if you see that the inhabitants of the city have some kind of possibility for their living and happiness, and you see that there's certain order in the city, then you conclude that there's a probably some law governing body, some wisdom behind that city. Or he has these analogies about the music and a composer, or even an army and its general, and all sorts of these other analogies that have nothing to do with machines, but are more focused on the general phenomenon of orderliness. So that's an important difference, I think, from the modern discussion where we've been so focused on just machines.
That's really interesting because, I mean, I think some of our audience would say, okay, those are different metaphors, you know, the metaphor of music versus the metaphor of a machine. But how is it that the metaphor actually impacts the underlying concepts and philosophies? Help our audience understand how using a different metaphor to understand the created world instead of the metaphor of a machine might alter the way you think about design and God's role in the universe.
For example, in a machine, of course, you're expecting that everything is ready-made at the start, in a kind of way. It's set up in that way. But then, if you have a musical composition, then those usually have some space for improvisation, maybe, or such things. Similarly,
like jazz, almost.
Yeah, like jazz, or take a military formation, then like a good military strategy is gonna leave some room for the people on the ground to improvise a little bit when the situation is changing. So that gives a kind of more dynamic picture, perhaps, of the order.
Okay, so it's sort of like, if you're thinking that the universe is a machine that God has created, then you're going to expect it to be perfect up front, and then nothing unfolds slowly over time. But if you're imagining creation as, say, a song, then it's going to slowly increase and rise, and it can unfold as a process that is designed, such as the evolutionary process, rather than God just snapped his fingers at the beginning of creation and everything was already automatically perfect and designed. That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, nowadays, of course, we also have machines and computer programs and such that make use of some kind of elements of randomness and development. But usually when people think about machines, they think about a very static picture.
Yeah. But that feeds into the whole connotation of, that these industrial-like metaphors more towards an atheistic picture, that everything is ready built, it's there, it doesn't need influences or divine action that are very proximate, as most Abrahamic traditions have you believe. And so that's why you will see some reactions against evolution, for instance, because it has this inherent indeterministic process that doesn't neatly fit into the machine metaphor. You will find people saying this is inherently a secular worldview or inherently an atheistic worldview. So metaphors also have this ecosystem, mental ecosystem, through which people are able to digest or reject certain theories. So the metaphor really is, to some extent, an entry point into what the mass psyche is of the population you're dealing with.
That's interesting. So would you say that, perhaps in the Middle Ages, the more Abrahamic traditions had more of a living, organic view of creation, where God was integrated with it, but it was, it wasn't just this static, dead machine. And then in the modern age, we started to have this view that everything was a machine. And Christians, instead of rejecting that view, kind of got on board and said, yes, it is a machine, and God is the one who made the machine. But then when evolution comes along, it's like, well, evolution doesn't quite work with the machine metaphor because it's less rigid and static. And then Christians thought that they had to defend the metaphor of the machine against evolution, when ironically, they could have just gone back to the more organic, process, lively, vivacious view that evolution was ushering them to return to. Yeah. Is that kind of what's going on there? We end up defending the mechanistic worldview instead of theism itself against evolution. Am I understanding that right?
Well, I think that, of course, the devil is in the details, but largely I think that's correct. And there's a reason why, you know, the 19th century is so important for this particular metaphor to come to the fore. You have the industrial age, steam engines, you know, all these machine-like hard industrial metaphors. Like we say, I'll wire you the money even today. That's an industrial metaphor, right? So for example, so we have artifacts of that still influence the way we think today. We refer to things as the camera, and we use that as a metaphor for our eye, right? When the eye is more than just a machine, it allows you to ponder over God's beauty. It's more than just a machine. Right. So definitely, I think that the 19th century developments really did affect the metaphors that we use. And there's a really good book. I think Michael Ruse, he mentioned it, the mechanization of the world. It was a book written in the 1950s. Do you guys know the book that I'm referring to? Very, very interesting text. It was in the 1950s. I forgot the name.
I know Michael Ruse.
Yeah, Michael Ruse is the
you knew Michael Ruse. Now let's pause. Let's have a moment of silence. Yeah. So.
Yeah, but Michael, the legend that he was, he had this reference, and I remember it took me ages to find it. It's from the early 1950s, and it talks about the mechanization and how these worldview transformations took place. I think it's written by a German scholar. I need to remember the name, but that was a very, very good book. That was a very, very insightful text. And the other one is the more famous one is The Metaphysical Foundations of Science, and I think it's by starts with E. I forgot the name. Do you know the book, Erky, by any chance?
I actually know it, but I also can't get the
it's
name.
Not Finkelstein, right?
No. The Metaphysical Foundations of Science is such a phenomenal text. It was written in the 1930s. Like, you know, we're talking about more than a century ago now. But it's a really, really, really good text. And E.A. Burt, that's the one. E.A. Burt.
Yeah, Burt. Yeah. I read that back when I was doing my master's thesis.
Yeah, that is a sick text that shows you how from Descartes all the way up to the modern period, you get these, you know, worldview transformations. And usually it starts with, to some degree, with Descartes, this mechanizing of our worldviews.
Everything falls at the feet of Descartes, doesn't it?
I mean, yes. Of course, even if you use a machine metaphor, you don't have to think of the universe as literally a machine. You can just think that it has certain analogies with machinery, even though it's also more than a machine. So for that reason, I think Shaoib is right in saying that the devil is in the details. So we're giving a really broad picture here. But at least it's possible to interpret these machine-like analogies in a way that are not so congenial to the combination of evolution and design arguments, for example. Whereas when I look at the early Christian authors, I see them arguing for design based on these very general orderly patterns in nature and the way different forces that are acting in nature come together to bring about some sort of harmonious result. And then they argue that this sort of harmony of opposites and general order of nature are better explained or somehow testify of the creator. So in my view, on such a framework, it seems like evolution would be taken as an example of that kind of order and not necessarily a contradiction to it.
Does that in some sense, though, lessen the evidential impact, right? If we're talking about a more generic sense of design, are we in some sense losing the power of the argument?
So I guess we can have different types of design arguments. Like we could have we could have the intelligent design style argument with with certain gaps in nature. That's one type of argument that people can try to make. But then there's also a lot of other versions of the design argument that don't rely on such gaps. And you might say that perhaps there's some value in this kind of miracle type arguments, although the ID proponents wouldn't want to call their arguments miracle arguments, but maybe there's some value in showing that there's more to nature than just natural processes. But on the other hand, no theist would probably want to say that God only acts in those gaps in nature. So you have to find some way of saying that also those features that are part of the order are the responsibility of God in some way, or can even testify of God. I guess these different design arguments just have their own strengths and weaknesses. Maybe the weakness of the ID argument might be, for example, that the premises are not accepted by the majority of the scientific community, for example.
Most scientists believe in evolution.
Right. The strength of a fine-tuning argument, for example, would be that most scientists would affirm the premise of fine-tuning, although there's some who are critical of it. But then perhaps a weakness of that argument might be that it's a sort of abstract and quite difficult for ordinary people to understand what's the fine-tuning of the nuclear force, or what's the fine-tuning of the weak electromagnetic force, and they don't even know what the weak electromagnetic force is. It's much more much easier to talk about the design of the eye, or the design of the human nervous system, or the human heart, or something like that. So biological design arguments sort of bring design very close to you. You can see it whenever you look in the mirror, or whenever you wake up and think of the functions of your own body. You can see design. So that's the strength of the biological design argument. So what I've been trying to say in my other work is that you can have this strength of the biological design argument also without giving up on evolution.
So there's kind of, just to make sure that I understand this for our listeners, a lot of people think of design as, okay, nature exists, and then God comes in and tinkers with nature, and it's like, ooh, let's invent the platypus over here, and ooh, let's give humans eyes over here, and nature is assumed, and then God comes in and miraculously interrupts nature. And there are these gaps that nature can't explain because God's come in and done something. Like, I'm going to design the flagellum or whatever it is, and nature won't be able to explain this because it's a miracle. I did it. But there's a different way of thinking about design, which is, well, how did nature get here to begin with? How did the laws of the natural universe themselves come into being? What are the things that nature is? So instead of seeing design as interrupting nature, and therefore God exists, it's rather, how do we get nature? Why do these laws of gravity and these types of things exist to begin with? And so design isn't an interruption of nature, but rather nature itself at a more fundamental level is designed without even needing interruptions or miracles. So there's like two different ways of seeing design here. And of course, the biological makes the interruptions seem more present. If you can say, Darwin can't explain the eye, then that's a very close, like clearly God had to snap his fingers, interrupt nature, and design the eye. But you're saying there's another way of seeing this, which is, what if biology and the processes of evolution at a more fundamental level are inherently designed even without needing interruption?
Yeah.
Am I right?
So John, an analogy that I think I might have gotten from Rope in his book, but either way, is there's the watchmaker argument where you look at the watch and like, man, it must be designed. But then you like walk into a factory and see this factory blindly making watches day by day and see, you don't need a designer. Look, here's this mindless process that creates watches. And then to which you could just say, well, haven't we just made the problem worse? Who made the factory?
Yeah. Can I add? So there's an analogy that I use to depict the different kinds of design arguments in this macro setting, right? So imagine you have a high definition TV, right? So there's three arguments that I see coming out in the literature. So one is the argument from complexity, that something is just so complex. It's just unbelievable. Where did this complexity come from? So if you look at a TV, you open it up, all of these things are put together. So that kind of resonates with the argument from complexity. You then have the argument from regularities in nature. The very fact we have these amazing laws that we're discovering through science, both at our observable level, at the cosmic level, at the micro level. We have laws in all of these stages. This is a bit like, relying on the TV for constant operations. When you push the volume button up, the volume goes up. You push the volume button down, the volume goes down, right? So there is a sense of regularity built into it. And then the third kind of argument is this idea that you have these fine-tuned constants. This is where the FTA comes in, right? The fine-tuning argument. So we have these amazing, physical constants that can only exist in a certain bandwidth, beyond which the life as we know would cease to exist. And there's about 30 of them so far, right? And that is equivalent to the brightness settings or the contrast settings. If you make it too bright or too dark, you can't see it on the screen, right? So we just have this right in the Goldilocks zone kind of matrix that we're in that seems to give rise to this amazing complexity. And these are independent arguments to some extent, right? You can talk about regularities from one angle. You can talk about complexity from another angle. You can talk about this fine-tuning. And what's really amazing is fine-tuning only came to the fore in the past century, right? That's the remarkable thing about fine-tuning. This was totally unprecedented. That's why I think it was Fred Hoyle. I think he was shocked by, that the world is so finely tuned because it smacks of a designer, right?
A super intellect that has monkeyed with physics.
Yeah. So these are the different ways that you can kind of, categorize design: by complexity, by constants, by regularities. That's the way I see it.
So let me kind of just put it to you. We've talked about a lot of different design arguments, ID, broader arguments. You've talked about the sensus divinitatis that comes from a non-Christian tradition. What's the best one? If you had an elevator pitch to someone, I got to put it to you guys, you're the experts. What's the one you think is just absolutely the best of all the ones you've encountered? And you can define best however you want.
Hang on. What I'd like to do is actually all four of us contribute to the discussion. So each one of us should inform, because you guys have opinions as well. It's not just me and Erky, right? So we'll start off with you, Erky.
Hey, now.
I've already embarrassed myself enough. I'm the only one who's not an expert on design and teleology in this conversation. So I just need to shut up now.
Oh, no, it's okay. We'll all make fool ourselves. It's later down the line. It's all good. Erky, let's start off with you. What's your favorite design argument?
Well, I like to go for a cumulative case. We have an article in our book on what's the relationship between cosmic and fine-tuning and biological design arguments. Are they friends or enemies, or what? How do they fit together? So I tend to think that it's a kind of a cumulative case where they support each other. So, for example, if you think that there's something to biology that seems designed, then it kind of start to think, well, maybe I might want to find, or maybe it would be possible to find some signs of that intelligence in the laws of nature as well.
I feel like that's cheating. You can't just do all of them, Rope.
Yeah, Erky, one. You gotta choose one, bro. The cumulative. We could say, all philosophy, religion. That's the argument for God's existence.
What I've been working on is the biological argument, so I'm gonna say that's my favorite argument. But I'm gonna, yeah, because yeah, I'm
just sure look at me. I'm clearly designed.
I'm not sure that if that's the strongest one, but I feel like that's the one that brings out the design intuitions pretty well, and sort of it's sort of in your face, because it's actually in your face. Your face is designed, so.
Okay.
And it's very intuitive, and then I would use the others as sort of supporting evidence and try to argue based on this general orderliness of nature. One thing that I would want to say also is that I have to defend the rationality of design arguments in a way that doesn't make the early Christians, early Jews, and early Greeks and Muslims irrational. So if I say that, well, actually, belief in design is only justified because we found the fine-tuning evidence, or we found out about the flagellum, then where does that leave all the early Christians? Did they just, did they get to the correct conclusion by chance, or did they just, they got it from divine revelation, but they actually did think that the evidence of nature itself also supports this belief in a creator. So for that reason, I would want to defend a kind of general level design argument as having at least some plausibility.
So would that be sort of an intuitive phenomenological case? It's not like you need to get into the mathematics and physics and the biology. You can just sort of step outside, and it's not a reasoning case. Oh, that tree looks constructed, therefore I'm convinced. It's more just an intuitive awe and wonder, and you're overwhelmed by the aesthetic and intellectual power of the experience of existing. Is that kind of, it's just an intuitive phenomenological type of thing?
I mean, usually our intuitions are also affected by our ways of thinking, and so there's a kind of a loop there. But I would say that I want to defend the rationality of those intuitions, and I would want to say that also the further exploration is of value in defending the rationality of those intuitions and sort of giving you a more certain grounding for those intuitive ways of thinking. So for example, if you make like an intuitive inference about a woman, and you think that, well, this woman seems really attractive, and maybe I would like to marry her. So you have this kind of intuitive experience, but you also kind of want to use your reason and sort of think through it very carefully, so that you aren't just led by your emotions and your body, but rather you're thinking through her character and all sorts of features. And is this the sort of person you want to build a life together? So I think you want to do the same with the design argument. You want to have the intuition, but you also want to have the rational reasons.
I didn't think through my choice of a mate very carefully, because now I'm married to Seth's sister, and I'm stuck with him forever. And it was a horrible decision.
You got a podcast
so she's great.
Out of it.
She's great, but like I'm stuck with this punk all the time. So thank you, Rope.
I mean, I really just want to point. You gotta think about how you make the best of the situation. Then you develop your own character.
Till Death Do Us Apart has a new meaning now, Jonathan, in your life. So.
Yeah, it does. Me and Seth have matching tattoos, actually, so we're branded forever.
They say brothers too. I know, isn't that great?
Interesting. Very interesting.
So I just want to know. I just want to point out that, like, for the first time ever, you've made the design argument applicable for dating, and so we have a large college audience from college listening. So if you take anything away, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, Seth, what's your favorite design argument? And don't just say the one that you're writing about in me. Yeah.
No, so my favorite design argument is the one I'm writing about. It's my favorite, right? But I did say what do I think is the best. I don't think the one that is in my dissertation recently is the best, or in the chapter that I've contributed to their volume. I think the best one, honestly, still has to just be the fine-tuning. And I know that I don't want to, I sympathize with the idea of, like, don't make these prior thinkers obsolete. And I 100% agree with that. But at the same time, I also got to agree with Shaoib that we do think very mechanistically in our culture. So best in the sense of most persuasive, this is the one that I see people go, whoa. That's the one I see people, just when you put numbers to the fine-tuning argument, when you talk about, like, the universe and how precisely it is designed for the eventual existence of complex life like us, it's just amazing to people. It really does amaze people quite a bit. And I think the ancients would have probably had the same opinion. So, I mean, I don't think that's just a modern thing. I think we, with our mechanistic understanding, gravitate towards that. And so that's why I like it.
Right. Okay. All right.
I mean, of course, that this evidence is really exciting and interesting. So it definitely adds to the traditional case. So
right.
It sells.
It definitely sells. The way I would qualify my answer is that I agree with you, Seth, that hands down, if there were, like, a solid argument for design, FTA would be where I place my bets, 100%. However, that is for two groups of people. One, the philosophers, and two, people who have some STEM background. And that's not necessarily everybody, right? I don't think anyone can just sit down and start reading FTA and like, wow, that's amazing. I think that for non-STEM students, this is going to be still a challenge to understand and appreciate. What does it mean that 1 over 10 to the power 30 is the likelihood of this constant occurring? They may not be able to appreciate that, which is why I've had a bit of a shift in my own thinking. So I've actually gone through now several Arabic manuscripts to kind of see exactly how they were, thinking about these things. One of the most prominent theologians in terms of like scholastic theology, Islamic scholastic theology, is a guy called Razi. So he has this monumental work. Like he's written 50, 60 treatises on theology. His last work, he goes through 200 pages of extensive argumentation for contingency, for the kalam, for design. And he clearly says contingency is number one. Clearly he says it, right? It's number one. But to my utter shock, at the end of that 200-page discussion, he says, the best arguments for most people are the simple, phenomenological, intuitive arguments for design, because that's what scripture points to. And I was generally quite, moved by that this is, a philosopher par excellence, right? And he's making this claim. So I've now toned down on, how strong I think something is. I say it's very audience dependent is what I'd like to now qualify my response with. For me and the philosophers and STEM students, I think they can appreciate the FTA very, 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 I think, strongly for that. But I think for most people, the average, person on the street, I think this idea of this intuitive push, this phenomenological design, is really unbeatable. Like even now, like I go out, right? I'm in Edinburgh and I see, mountains. I see,
the heavens declare the glory of God.
Yeah, heavens declare the glory of God. And
if that can happen in Scotland, imagine if you lived in the US.
Or Canada, the Great White North.
No one lives there anyway.
So have you guys ever been to Arizona? Have you guys ever been to Phoenix?
I lived there. I lived there for a year.
Great. So, bro, that is one of the
There's no place Seth has not colonized. Sorry, go ahead.
That is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. Like the moment you just get into, close to the canyon, you just feel utter beauty all around you, right? So there's just something that you cannot convert into a proposition. You just cannot. And I agree with that. I think that there is, so I've had a shift in my thinking that I am now giving a lot more credence to this intuitive pull. And I think that depending on where you are, you can appreciate these different things depending on which stage of life you're in or who you're talking to.
That's so interesting because it's still design, it's still logos and reason, but it's also beauty, it's aesthetics, which of course those things align in the divine. I mean, depending on your model, but the one who is beauty, but also intelligence, mind itself. But how much of design is aesthetics in that sense? How much is logos and beauty merged here in these arguments?
Oh, that's a hard one. I don't know. All I know is that
18%.
That's a very logical answer. I'd like an answer like yellow or purple or something.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a conversation that we're hoping to provoke a little bit with our book, because a number of the essays do go into the rhetorics and beauty of design discourse. So, for example, we have this previously lost sermon by St. Augustine on design in chapter 3, Preaching Design, Theology and Rhetoric of Divine Order in Augustine's Sermons. So it's one of the newly discovered sermons by Augustine, and he's in which he goes into a very great detail about how the beauty of the mosquitoes, proboscis, for example, and there's a kind of funny rhetoric to it, to use this kind of annoying creature as an example of divine wisdom and the beauty of God's creation in a way. But
why that creature?
I mean, I think he just wanted to show that even in this small insect, and of course, in his day, of course, they couldn't observe the insect very closely, but so this is just observation that you can do by eye. But he was already able to appreciate, how the mechanisms of the proboscis and the way the insect sucks blood is very intelligently designed in his view.
Yeah. I don't know.
The vampire effect, the designed vampire. Twilight doesn't just happen; it requires a designer.
I don't know if this throws a grenade in the conversation, but it's not the philosophical discussions that move me towards the best of all possible worlds. It's actually the aesthetics. I'm wondering if you tweak the aesthetics of the existing world, would that somehow falter the beauty that we can kind of register on that intuitive level? It's something that I've been playing around with. I don't know.
Yeah, and you talked about there's a lot of stuff in your book there, and this gets into a lot of questions of epistemology. How much does aesthetics actually teach us about the world?
Yeah.
Is there, in some sense, I mean, I like the nice, rigid, logical arguments, and I think, like you said, people who are in STEM fields and philosophers really like that.
Yeah.
When it comes to like aesthetics and just sort of like, no, that's designed.
Yeah.
Like, how would you defend that? How is one even going to go about defending the idea that no, aesthetics can teach us about the world versus someone who might just say, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. That's just an intuition, but it's a sort of byproduct of X, Y, and Z.
I mean, in my previous work on the intelligent design debate, in which both the proponents and critics of intelligent design are really at pains to emphasize the scientific nature of their arguments. I mean, both for design and against design, but then somehow these considerations of beauty and goodness do end up mattering to both the critics and defenders of ideas. So I would say that it's not just for one side of the conversation to defend, because actually you can see this on all sides, and it is really relevant. Like we can certainly think about creatures that could be perhaps very well designed, but wouldn't sort of give us this kind of aesthetic appreciation, like a world of filled with the kind of organisms that you see in the movie Alien, for example. There's this famous quote from the 1979 movie, like that the alien organism is the perfect organism, and its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility. And if the world was full of organisms like that, maybe it wouldn't create this kind of intuition of beauty, and this might very well weaken the argument, or perhaps it would just change our view of the character of God, like how could God create beings like that. Some people ask this about our world, of course, too. So the problem of bad design or evil design, but most of us do also, perhaps while we may struggle with that, we do also feel a kind of transcendent beauty, appreciation of that.
You were able to rattle off Alien way too easily. You've seen that one too many times, Rope. I mean, I have too. So,
and it's interesting because, I mean, even with Alien, there's something beautiful there. I mean, there's something beautiful about the spider, about trees that don't have their leaves, about the infinite abyss of space. There's something that might not be good, that's terrifying and haunting about the alien, but goodness and aesthetics seem distinguished there. And so there's design without perhaps goodness, because you're terrified of it, but there's also aesthetics. And I wonder if there can be aesthetics without the appearance of design, because chaos is beautiful even if it's not structured. And I wonder if even chaos could, in that sense, point to the divine in its beauty, even if it doesn't point to the divine in its rational ordering. If that's a weird thought there.
Yeah.
I mean, you could probably separate the argument from beauty and the argument from design, even though this quite commonly do go together. Like it's a sort of a cumulative case, and in practice, people try to argue for something of which they already have a kind of aesthetic experience, usually. So the argument might not reflect all the facets that go into the evaluation of the propositions, like God's existence.
Yeah.
But One perhaps interesting feature of this historical discussion of design is also the way that people have evaluated the goodness of nature. And for example, how did the early Christians deal with the phenomenon of animal mortality or the existence of snakes and such and mosquitoes and so on? So that's an interesting discussion that contemporary discussions of design arguments should definitely learn from.
So if I can kind of pivot to a different discussion in the book while we still have the time, there are differences between the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian perspective. You kind of lumped them all together and talked about their mutual contribution. Was there any major difference or differences that you guys noticed emerge between the various traditions?
I think that there was an overall sense of unity in terms of where these different traditions are coming in from, and also how they're able to engage with contemporary conversations. Like, I'll give you one example that ties into your point, Seth. You talked about, you want these hard propositions in front of you to be able to follow the line of reasoning, right? One of our chapters actually takes a Plantingian approach. So this idea that you can have basic belief, that's where that sensus divinatus apparatus comes in, right? That design could just be a basic belief. You don't have to refer to it or justify it propositionally, so to speak, right? And it's interesting that even in the word Arabic, disbelief is called kufr. And the one who adopts disbelief is also called a kafir, the one who adopts disbelief. Another name, that very word is also used for a farmer because he covers seeds. So this idea that you are actually covering something that is so ingrained and hardwired in all of us that there is this ready-made reception to be able to engage with God's bounties around us, right? Or God's signs around us. So I think those resonances you can clearly see across the traditions. I didn't see anything that was like ultra unique or distinct. What I saw was, all of these traditions are, in light of their particular trajectories and contingencies, are engaging with, design through various ways, like this mosquito one. This was a new one for me. I don't think I've come across a mosquito discussion in the Islamic corpus. That may be something new there. But definitely, I think there's an overall resonance. I don't know, Erky, what did you make of it?
I mean, I was surprised at the amount of convergence actually across the traditions. So, and of course, our book also doesn't tell us about all the diversity in the traditions. We would have to have way more chapters to go through that. But historically, it also makes sense for there to be quite a lot of commonality. I mean, if you look at the way Jewish and Christian thinking about this developed, of course, it's very much in conjunction. If you look at the way the Islamic thinking developed, that's also very much in discussion with the Christian tradition. When the early Christians developed their own natural theology, this was taken up by the Syrian and the Arabic Christians as well. This style of natural theology, and was very much a contemplative style of natural theology. They developed the idea of two books of God's revelation, the Bible and nature, and the idea of God's signs, which you can see in nature, that you are to spiritually sort of supposed to be trained to recognize and appreciate God's wisdom in nature. And these themes pop up in the Quran, and they pop up then in the early Muslim tradition. Of course, the Muslim empires then had huge Christian Jewish populations as well, and Jewish and Christian scholars who continued to work on these topics. And so, for example, when we see even in our book, like if you look at my chapter where I end up with Athanasius's and Gregory of Nyssa's arguments on the way the harmony of opposite forces of nature and the way these come together to bring about beneficial results. That's proof of design. And then you just jump up a few chapters to on Al-Maturidi's natural theology, wise design, and the metaphysics of natural evil, and you actually find the same argument. But then you also find some unique features of Maturidi's thought, which are not necessarily like universal then with Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims or whatever. But you find the same argument, like the harmony of opposites being repeated. And as we know, then Thomas Aquinas and the medieval Christian theologians later pick up what the Muslims have been saying again. So there's this kind of intercultural discussion going on there.
Perhaps, Seth, just to answer your question, we may have the formation of a new argument through this book, the meta-Abrahamic argument for design. So meta-Abrahamic argument for design. What do you think of that, Erky? I think that could get us a JTF grant, I think.
Yeah, the mad argument. That sounds very persuasive, yeah.
I love the abbreviation. I love that it came about on this show. Let's make this happen. I want this to be the font point for the next development in design arguments.
We are owed a footnote whenever this comes out.
Sure, if this launches into a JTF grant, you can have as many footnotes as you want.
Well, this is a two-parter question. The first part of it is, so we've asked how the different traditions kind of approached the question of design. Can I make that even more narrow? How have the different Abrahamic faiths approached the question of evolution? And has that approach shown any significant differences in the three? And that is, of course, related to design, because how do you make sense of design and evolution? But specifically, have the three approached that question in significant ways that are indicative of a broader traditional differences?
I can start on this one, Erky, if you want. So in my opinion, I think that you will see the same spectrum across all three traditions. You will have people who have hardcore rejection when it comes to evolution. Have some people have no problem with accepting evolution, and you have some people in between. They accept evolution, but just not for human beings. You see that across all three, right? For example, the Reformed Judaism has absolutely no problem with evolution. That is not an issue there at all. So I don't think that there is anything like distinctive that one religion is more prone to rejecting evolution or one religion is more accepting of evolution. I do believe that it's religion plus. So religion plus the culture, religion plus the political and economic situations. The same connotations that you see with evolution being tied with Marxism, Leninism, right, atheism, you'll find that across all communities, depending on where they are and how far they can see through some of those connotations. So I don't really see evolution being, a specific discourse that leads to specific opinion in a religious conversation. I think it's heterogeneous. Would you agree with that, Erky?
Yeah, I think so too. All of these three traditions are in themselves a bit pluralistic in how they view the relationship between science and religion. So you have Christians and Jews and Muslims who reject evolution, and then you have many who accept it in all traditions. But what's really interesting to compare is maybe the details of how does the interpretation of scripture work out, for example. Are there some differences in the way scripture is interpreted in relation to science or not? What are the core theological issues? For example, it seems like the historicity of Adam and Eve, for example, would be a common one for all the traditions, or the question of how do scientific explanations and divine action relate to each other, or what are God's ways of creation? So we can ask all of these questions, and it seems to me we can find a surprising amount of common ground, actually.
Yeah, I wanna throw these two in the firing range. Jonathan, do you believe in a historical Adam and Eve? And the same question goes for you, Seth. I want to know.
To see our answer to that question, check out our Patreon. The link is in the description below. We have over 20 minutes more of this interview, along with hours of extended interviews from other big-name guests and unaired episodes that we haven't put out there yet, just for our Patreon members. We also have whole university courses. We have a world religions course, a history of Christian thought and philosophy course, all of that and more on our Patreon, all for less than the cost of a cup of coffee. Check it out. Link is in the description.
Well, John, are you going to buy my book now? Read the chapter that I wrote?
Yeah, it's not your book. Yeah, you just have one chapter in it.
A great chapter.
And I mean, it was the worst chapter. I mean,
you haven't read it.
I intuited it.
Judging a book by its cover.
I'm judging it by its you. If you're the cover, then yeah.
Did you notice there was a point there like we got all these prestigious scholars to go in the book, and I'm just sitting there. I'm just like, all right,
yes, I am.
Why, yes, prestigious scholars indeed.
Thank you, ladies. You didn't have to say that.
What are your thoughts on the teleological argument?
On the design argument?
On the design argument.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's very powerful. I think I'm less comfortable with the biological design argument, not because it's not valid. I think it's just more complicated, and I'm less of an expert in that area than you are. But I find the cosmological argument, like the constants after the Big Bang, gravity, the expansion rate of the universe, all of these things being just sort of perfect, I find that very persuasive.
What about
as well?
What about the idea of it's just a sort of fundamental intuition? That you go outside and you're like, wow, this has to have a designer.
Yeah, I think there's validity to that fundamental intuition. You could just say, well, your intuition's wrong, but, we have to trust our intuitions in order to even get off the ground with knowledge. Like, how do you know the physical world is real? It's just intuitively, obviously real. Like, you have to make those sort of intuition type claims all the time before knowledge even gets off the ground. So you can't just throw out your intuitions. That doesn't mean all intuitions are true, but having an intuition of something certainly adds probability to it being true. And I think the intuition of design adds legitimate probability to it being valid. Going out in the world and just having this awestruck sense of, wow, this is magnificent, marvelous, beautiful, intricate, clearly the work of a master artist. I think that intuition, aside from any evidence, is valid. It doesn't lead to certainty that there's a designer, but it adds a little bit of probability to it, much like all intuitions do.
Sure. I mean, nothing adds certainty in that sense, but let me play the skeptic, right? Because your intuitions are only valid so long as you have good justification for believing that's a good intuition. So I might have an intuition that chocolate is better than vanilla, right? And yet when I meet a bunch of other people who are like, no, actually I like vanilla more than chocolate. In some sense, it's like, okay, well, maybe that's just an opinion. Maybe that's not an objective fact out there in the world that chocolate's better than vanilla.
Yeah, so I don't think your intuitions need evidence to validate themselves, because evidence is a series of intuitions combined together to create a conclusion. You can't even talk about evidence without trusting your prior intuitions, and otherwise you don't have access to the world. So I don't think your intuition needs to be vindicated by evidence. I think intuitions can stand up on their own. However, if there are counter evidences to your intuition, then so I don't think an intuition needs to be supported in order to be believed. I think it just needs to not be negated by our other intuitions.
Well, that's kind of my point.
And that's when it becomes more complicated. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of my point, right? Because with the chocolate vanilla illustration, what shows me that that's just an opinion, that it's not really based on an objective fact, is encountering other people who don't share in that intuition. Who don't share in the fact that, oh, chocolate is just objectively better than vanilla. And encountering that, other people, there are some people who disagree, some people agree with me, and others don't. And I just go, well, it must just be an opinion. Well, there are people out there who they look at the world and they don't have that sensus divinitatis. They don't get that sense of the divine when they look at the world. They look at the world and it's like, now this world's kind of screwed up. It's pretty badly put together. I don't think that this evidence is God at all. And they don't share in that intuition. And so isn't the same logic being applied there?
I think it does then make your intuition less, it moderates it. It doesn't negate the evidence of the intuition, though. It just puts it within a context. So like if the intuition adds a certain degree of probability to God being real, the intuitions of others, is then balanced against that. It doesn't negate the probability that your intuition is added. It just means that then that intuition needs to be put into conversation with those others.
Well, apply that same logic to the chocolate vanilla.
Of course. And it is like the fact that I think chocolate is better than vanilla adds a little probability to it being so. It doesn't make it certain, though, and the probability added by everyone else disagreeing ultimately outweighs the probability of my initial intuition. But that doesn't mean the initial intuition itself was invalid or didn't add probability.
Here's the thing, right? I would want these arguments. We want them to be good arguments, and if it makes it just negligibly better, that's not a good argument. So, for instance, if I pray, God, I score really well on this test. You know, I'm a student and I want to pray, and then I do score really well. Well, that actually adds a tiny probability that God exists, a supposedly answered prayer. But we wouldn't call that a great argument for the existence of God. That the one test, good test answered prayer argument, that's not a good argument. And if the intuition argument that the world seems designed is at the same level as chocolate being better than vanilla, it's not a good argument. And we should throw it out as good, focus on other arguments.
I just don't think it is at that level. I think if you look at history and globally, the vast majority of cultures have believed in a creator or a supernatural other who is in some way orchestrating events, whether through astrologically the stars or through the hand of God. They're like most cultures and most people throughout history and throughout the globe believe in a designer. And a lot of, I think of it, comes back to this intuition. It's not a random intuition that me as a random white guy in America has. It's a strong intuition. And if like 90% of people throughout history and throughout the globe thought that chocolate was better than vanilla, then yeah, that intuition would mean something. The thing is that 90% of people don't think chocolate is better than vanilla. But like 90% of humanity historically and globally has gone outside, felt wonder, and appealed to some higher sense of something higher. And so that intuition is not just my individual one, it's a human one. It's a very strong one. I think it's as strong as our sense of morality. Yes, there might be sociopaths who don't share in those intuitions, but the vast majority of us do. And so I think morality is valid and points to one who is goodness itself. I don't think that's a bad argument. In the same way that I think most humans are logical, but there's some humans who don't share my rational view of the world at all. But that doesn't mean my intuition is negated by their intuition.
No one can think of a contradiction. That's just not true. It's 100%.
How would you know? If someone had thought of a contradiction, how would they communicate that to you?
Well, that's the thing. Can you think of a single instance of someone who has?
But how could they? That's the point.
They can.
If they've actually accessed something that transcends reason, how would they communicate it to people who are stuck in their rational frameworks?
Well, even the language you're using there is using reason. We're about to go off on a different thing. Here's the thing.
I'm not saying reason is negated.
Let me go. So here's the thing. What percent is it then? So let's say 70% of people prefer chocolate over vanilla. Is that enough? You say 90% is. So, like, you seem to have this line in your head that you think, oh, now all of a sudden it becomes a good argument when there's enough universal consent. And yet I'm just not convinced by that. I don't think universal consent is necessarily a thing. If 90% of people think chocolate is better than broccoli, and probably 90% of people do think chocolate is better than broccoli, it's still an opinion thing. You know what I'm saying?
So, but where is the line here? So how does science claim to be objective? It's based on a series of assumptions that are ultimately based on intuitions. It's based on the intuition that the material world is real, based on the intuition that we are rational, based on the intuition that the world is rational, and based on the intuition that our rational mind has access to the rational world such that the one corresponds to the other and
but
can
there's nothing to undermine those claims. There is.
The vast majority of humans historically have not embraced the scientific method. And if you consider the fact of Platonism in the West and Buddhism and Hinduism in the East, you could argue that the vast majority of humans throughout history have not believed that the material world was objectively real. So like the assumptions of science are based on a series of intuitions that are deeply rejected by arguably the majority of humanity throughout time.
That's not true. And I think you're kind of manipulating things here. And here's why, because Buddhism and Hinduism don't deny that the world appears to be real. Of course they do. That's one of their fundamental assumptions, is they're trying to overcome the illusion of the reality of the material world.
Similarly, chocolate appears to be superior to vanilla, but it objectively isn't.
Right, because we have good evidence from the rejection from other evidences. And that's why I think we should consider the evidences of that. Science doesn't make a claim about, the truth of it. If you get into the philosophy of science, there's a lot of debate about how much truth science actually reveals, or if all these they're just models, and there are scientific anti-realists. Scientists tries to get us testable and repeatable claims. Now, a lot of scientists very naively will go into philosophy and say, well, yeah, no, of course, all these things are real, blah, blah, blah. But when you actually ask the philosophers of science, they're a lot more skeptical. So if anything, I think that proves my point.
I think it proves my point, because you're trying to argue that we need to get past this intuitive, subjective realm of intuitions and get down to actual evidence and arguments. But what you've just said is that the evidence and arguments doesn't actually guarantee that you get access to the world, and that a lot of scientists don't actually believe their science gets you access to the world. It just gives you more intuitions.
When you share assumptions with your, say, atheist friend, you can use that. Most atheists will believe that science gives us some objective grasp of the world. I also agree that science gives us some objective grasp of the world. Therefore, it can be a good argument. The problem is most atheists will think that the design intuition is more so like chocolate and vanilla. And that's why I don't think it's a good argument. Yeah, you can maybe say, okay, I disagree with that, but it's a battle of whether this intuition is more like chocolate or vanilla, or whether the objective world is real or not. How do you know? There's no getting behind that to know. And so therefore, it doesn't seem like it's a good argument. Again, I should clarify, I'm just playing. I don't actually believe this. I'm just saying this for the sake of discussion.
Well, I don't think what is apologetically useful is what is necessarily the best argument. Just because something can be apologetically useful to a certain group of people doesn't mean that that's the basis on which I decide what's a good argument for me. Secondly, I would say I actually think a lot of atheists do have this intuition, or at least they did have it as a kid. But so much of our society, including religious people in our society, have bought in to the basic paradigms of modernity and the Enlightenment and sort of the Lockean approach to the physical world and the sciences.
That wasn't my claim.
Let me finish.
But you're hitting, let me clarify real quick. I'm not saying they don't have this intuition. I'm saying they think this intuition is like chocolate and vanilla.
Yeah, because they've bought into a modern scientific paradigm that has negated all of our aesthetic, moral, and phenomenological intuitions in place of this scientific behemoth that was ultimately itself based on those intuitions. We've just forgotten, and we now think it's objective in some way that has transcended the usual epistemological crisis of intuitions. But it hasn't.
You use a lot of big words there. Can you simplify that?
Here's my point. I think most atheists do have an encounter with the world as being this wondrous, aesthetic, moral, like there's this intuition of the divine that they have within it. But quickly, that gets deconstructed by our modern scientific framework that says that those types of intuitions are silly and subjective, and you need to grow up and move past them. Mm-hmm. Well, pretending that the scientific worldview itself wasn't ultimately built on an accumulation of those intuitions. You can't throw out intuition and still have access to the world. And so that's my thing.
No one claims that.
I'm sure a lot of atheists do reject those intuitions, but I don't think they should. And I don't think we should grant their premise that those intuitions are silly or that they don't have those intuitions. I'd rather fight back on the ground of the intuitions themselves rather than play into their game. Because once you're playing into their game, they're ultimately going to win if it's on their turf. I would rather change the turf.
What you're doing is saying, I mean, we have to say some intuitions are just subjective. They don't tell us about the world. We can't just go with every intuition tells us about the world. Otherwise, we would say, obviously, well, then it's not an opinion. Chocolate really is better than broccoli, because the vast majority of people agree to that. And yet we don't.
Obviously grant that. You interrupted me to clarify something. I'm going to interrupt you to clarify something. I believe our intuitions have to go to war with each other. What I don't grant is the modern idea that your emotional experiences of beauty and goodness are always stupid and don't have any validity. So I think those are valid intuitions.
I don't think anyone thinks that.
They have to be lined up against other intuitions, such as your rational scientific intuitions. But the sheer fact that they're moral and aesthetic intuitions does not mean they're silly or stupid.
Okay.
I am granting that intuitions have to be put up against each other, and you have to decide which ones are ultimately valid and which ones aren't.
How do you do that?
I think you do it the way that everyone's done it, but I don't simply say that science trumps all of my moral and aesthetic intuitions. I actually think my moral and aesthetic intuitions are more powerful than my sense of the material world existing.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
Are you serious? Think about it. Your experience that the Holocaust is objectively morally wrong. Do you think that that is ethically as convincing and persuasive as the fact that the physical world is real? A physical world that quantum physics has kind of shown is deeply not what we thought it was in the real sense already. Kind of. Like, which of those experiences is more powerful? I'm more convinced the Holocaust is morally objectively wrong than I am that the physical material world is real.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I'm more convinced that chocolate is better than broccoli than either of those, and yet that's still a subjective thing. There's got to be an independent measure.
And what's the independent measure you're going to? What's your independent measure?
What is my independent measure? It's not just universal consent. You've got to look at these intuitions individually one by one and ask, is there contrary arguments that can undermine them? I think there are contrary arguments that can undermine the design argument, which is our design inference gets it wrong sometimes. It really does. But I've never been shown wrong that the external world exists. No one's ever shown me, oh, it's just, it's not there, right? I can have illusions of particular things, but that doesn't undermine the entire bracket of that, right? So here's my thing, because we got to finish up real quick, though. You got out of it having to answer your favorite argument for design or favorite teleological argument.
It's the one you started with. You brought it up first.
Yeah, is this it then? Is it the intuitional argument? Is that your favorite?
No.
What is?
My favorite is the argument from the constants after the Big Bang.
Then just stick with that. Get rid of the other one.
No, I don't think... I think the aesthetic intuitive argument stands on its own, even without that.
I mean, I agree,
when those two things come together, it's wonderful, and it makes a more coherent, less disjointed worldview. But that doesn't mean the one experience is invalid unless the other comes alongside it.
Just read my book. My argument in that book is just the best one there is. It'll solve everything. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe below, or to check us out on Spotify. And if you want to hear more from this week's episode or guest, our Patreon account has exclusive unaired content, often featuring up to an hour of additional footage and interviews for each episode. We save some of the most controversial and pulse-pounding topics just for our Patreon members. Members get access to that, plus a chance to meet monthly with Jonathan and I, suggest episode topics, join us live for an episode to ask the special guests questions, or even get a personalized episode custom-made just for you. Check out our Patreon link in the description below. And don't forget to check out our official website at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com to see what else you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.